closing in on the now third year of war between Russia and Ukraine, we have to finally start asking a hard question. Are we nearing the end game? Despite all the comments and all the speeches that have been made and all the requests for ammunition and weapons and everything else from all these different Ukrainian and Western leaders, is the reality on the ground finally breaking through to expose the mendacity and the fiction and everything else? I think that you probably know where this is going to go. And to try to discuss this today, we have Alexander Mercouris, co-host of the Duran, one of the best analysts on the internet, and we're privileged to have you on today.
Well, I'm very privileged and very happy and delighted to be here, Daniel. And I think we're going to have a lot to discuss. And I should say I always learn lots from these programs too.
Well, I always look forward to having you on our show because you always have insights that a lot of people don't have, and especially when it has anything to do with a lot of the UK stuff. A lot of our American audiences don't understand, some of the things that may be behind the scenes, and you do. And I'm sorry if you'll forgive me for a minute. It's kind of warm in here. I'm just going to take my jacket off, and as I got my official the Duran shirt here today.
My gosh, you do! Wow. Wow.
Yeah, for those who don't know, if you go to the Duran, they got a little thing there where you can order merch, and it's good stuff. So I saw it the other day and thought, I want to get one of those. So here it is. I'm in an official Duran merch uniform today. So appreciate that.
I certainly appreciate that. Thank you, Daniel.
Well, that is a good beginning. Let's just jump right in here. So as we've been talking, you've been on our show several times, and we talked about the course of the war, where it's going, where it's not going. And we just have this parade of senior officials in multiple Western governments keep acting like everything's going good for the Ukraine side. But then we see when we actually turn to the battlefield, we see things aren't quite going that direction. Here I want to show you is the latest from Zelensky just a few days ago, talking about where he wanted to go with the war.
We will continue to present our strategy for forcing Russia into peace to our European partners. And we need to act right now to prevent Russia and its accomplices from adapting to our capabilities. We see an increasing alliance between Russia and regimes like North Korea. This is no longer just about transferring weapons. It is actually about transferring people from North Korea to the occupying military forces. When we talk about giving Ukraine greater long-range capabilities and more decisive supplies for our forces, it's not just a list of military equipment. It's about increasing the pressure on the aggressor pressure that will be stronger than what Russia can handle. And it's about preventing an even larger war. True peace can only be achieved through strength, and the entire next week will be dedicated to working with our partners for the sake of such strength, for the sake of true peace.
Sake of true peace. Now that was delivered just before he unveiled his victory plan at his parliament, where he said point number one on his victory plan was entry into NATO immediately, kind of thing. Gosh, if we only talked about that one point there, it seems like that seems to be pretty detached from reality. What say you?
Well, he's completely detached from reality, because if such an invitation to Ukraine were ever to be made, well, the Russians would not see that as a reason to make peace. They would see that as confirming that their greatest fear about Ukraine was coming true, and it would almost certainly provoke them to intensify even further the war. And on our side, I think we must dispose of this fallacy that we haven't tried very hard to make Ukraine win, or at least fight the Russians to a standstill. If we start inviting Ukraine to join NATO, then what we would be doing is we would be going even further than that. We would be taking on commitments to defend Ukraine. That is basically what Zelensky wants us to do, to defend Ukraine in a way that could well involve us in a war with the Russians, which would in effect be, a way forward towards a world war, as no less a person than the President of the United States himself pointed out right at the start of this thing. in March 2022. If American soldiers and Russian soldiers are fighting each other, you have World War III. That is what the President of the United States said, and that is what bringing Ukraine into NATO would amount to. No NATO country, none of the big ones, not Germany, not France, not Britain, not the United States, wants to go there. And for that reason, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and one wonders, when Biden made that comment at the very beginning of the war, it seemed like, well, he's pretty smart about that. That at least he understands where the lines are. He seems to have forgotten after making that comment. I don't hear him say that very much anymore. And then it morphed into, we're going to support them for as long as it takes. He never said as long as it takes to what, but yeah, that seems to be an affliction that many suffer from. And it's not just Zelensky. One of his senior advisors, Yermak, actually, I guess it was last week now, listed out the terms of which they were willing to reach a negotiated settlement with Russia. How very nice of him. According to this article here, the Yermak, the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, stated that Ukraine has taken a firm stance against any freezing of the current war, stating that the key conditions for initiating negotiations with Russia is the complete withdrawal of Russian forces to the positions they held before February 2022. Now, I just got to ask. I mean, I get optimism. I get trying to put a happy face on, something, lipstick on a pig. But when you're talking about as late as this thing is in the war and coming after the entirety of the year 2023, when they tried to go on the offensive against Russia, broke their teeth on the first of 5 lines, never penetrated beyond that, lost tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of troops. And then now the entirety of calendar year 2024, they've been losing territory up to 200 square kilometers in the last 7 days alone. Then you make this comment here that we won't even talk to you until you evacuate from our country. What is behind statements like that in light of reality?
I mean, it is completely unrealistic. I mean, it is fantasy. I mean, Yermak is talking absurdly. But it's absolutely clear to me that the government in Ukraine, for whatever reason, is incapable of conducting negotiations, even as everything falls apart around them. And of course, they're not the first government that has put itself or found itself in that situation and takes that kind of stance. But that's the stance that they're taking. So they have completely ruled out negotiations. They obviously feel that if they start negotiating with the Russians in a serious way, they will be forced into concessions that they will never agree to and cannot make. So the result is that we're going to have a situation where the Ukrainians try to do something else because they know they're losing the war. This is the thing people need to understand. Yermak, Zelensky, all of these people, however disconnected from reality they may be, they're not so disconnected that they don't get the information from the battlefronts. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to find some means, some mechanism to get the West to fight the war for them. That's what the victory plan is. That is what the peace plan is. That is everything else that is everything now that they're working towards. And in the meantime, they come up with all of these extraordinary statements, and they're basically saying to us, give us what we want, give us everything we want, fight the war for us. Because if you don't, we will go down fighting. It will be an enormous, terrible disaster for you. Your prestige is now on the line. Your credibility is on the line. Don't expect us to negotiate. Don't expect us to agree a freeze. Don't expect us to talk to the Russians. So if you want the disaster of us being defeated, then come to our rescue instead.
Wow. Well, there is a certain logic behind that, even though it's really weird and has no chance of success. But I guess you can say, well, this is what I'm trying to do, because there is, I guess, when I say some logic, there is some credibility to the argument, which I've been saying for many, many months now. If we keep going down the path of fiction and supporting the war and continuing to ignore the reality here, that there will come a point to where the Ukrainian army can no longer maintain its integrity and it will collapse, and the Russian army will win. And we will be faced with the specter of either acknowledging that everything we did for nearly 3 years, all the money, all the statements, all the weapons, everything that we had, the best of American and European equipment, all failed and was defeated on the battlefield, and we have to deal with that, or we have to risk escalation. And so from that perspective, I guess that it's not an empty threat.
Well, it's not an empty threat, but nonetheless, we should not fool ourselves. It is still mad. I mean, the logic, there is a logic there, but logic can sometimes be mad. And this is a kind of mad
totally agree.
I mean, don't come and win my war for me, because if you don't, I will commit suicide and you will be to blame. I mean, that's essentially what the Ukrainians are telling us. And we should not be intimidated by that. I mean, it's not fair when we talk about the Ukrainians. It is not fair to the Ukrainian people to go along with that kind of madness. Obviously, one can understand why Zelensky and his own officials have take this kind of stance. They're boxed in by their own rhetoric, by their own ambitions. They're frightened of the various radicals around them who are themselves in the grip of a kind of romantic nationalism and all of that. But the Ukrainian people deserve a lot better. Many of them have fought very hard and they fought very bravely. We can't just say to them, well, because your leaders take this utterly fantastic position, we are going to go along with it and risk an even greater disaster in order to help them. And if the Ukrainians won't negotiate, because this is the stance that the Zelensky government is taking, I'm going to say what I personally think. I think we should tell them, well, in that case, if you won't negotiate, then you leave us with no choice. We must speak to the Russians in your place. And so much, for as long as it takes and all of that. That is my own view.
Well, I would love it. How about you become the next NATO Secretary General? And we'll fire the other guy right now. So, I mean, he hadn't even got his office unpacked yet. So this is probably a good time to make that switch. I totally endorse what you said there. I would love it if any Western leader would do that. But instead, it's funny. I on the one hand, I'll say that, well, Zelensky can say this, Yermak can say this stuff. They can have that mentality, this basically, I'm going to hold my breath until I die if you don't do what I say, etc. But I thought, but that's ridiculous because the West would never do that. But yet you have statements like one of your British colleagues, Grant Shapps, recently wrote a piece where he basically argued that if we let Ukraine fall, Taiwan will be next, and then we'll really be at war. But here's the one of the biggest flaws in his argument at all. He operates from the assumption that the war can be won, that there is some magic amount of equipment or something else that can be done, that somehow that Ukraine can actually prevail and Russia lose, which is what he's saying is desperately needed. Now, I don't want to go into the discussion about what's going on in Asia with what Xi Jinping decides is totally on his own deal. He could care less about what happens or doesn't happen here because there's a bunch of other factors. But I want to focus on Shapps and many other Western supporters who have this assumption that the war can be won and therefore we should do more. What do you view on that?
No, I'm absolutely entirely in agreement with you. If first of all, just to make this fairly obvious point, if a defeat in Ukraine is going to encourage the Chinese, then that was a very, very good reason not to let oneself get drawn into a war in Ukraine against the Russians in the first place. I mean, that seems to me obvious, but I agree. Let's just put that to one side. The fact is, we're not going to win the war in Ukraine. The Russians are. The more time is spent debating this, the more complete the Russian victory is going to be. The more Ukrainians are going to die, the more the disaster for Ukraine will be, the more the damage to the credibility, or at least to the face of some people in the West, is going to be. So when Grant Shapps talks in that way, actually, if you apply actual logic, that is a reason for ending the war sooner rather than later, whilst we still have a Ukraine that we can support once the war is done. But of course, they don't see it in that way, because everything for them is some kind of, people like Grant Shapps, is some kind of chess game. We can't lose to the Russians. We can't allow the Russians to win. Even though I'm going to say, I think the Russians, if we were prepared to speak to them, they would probably be prepared to speak to us, not because they like us, but because it is in their interests too. And they're very tough-minded, very hard-headed people, as they have repeatedly shown. And they understand that a long, prolonged conflict with the West in Europe is no more in their interests than it is in ours. So we can negotiate. We shouldn't worry about other things like, Taiwan. The time to worry about that is long since gone, in my opinion, anyway. Sit down, talk with the Russians, try to save Ukraine, bring the war to an end, save as many lives as possible, and make peace. And make peace in a way that preserves a Ukraine that we can support afterwards.
Well, and of course, we've had many opportunities to get there already. We don't have to have some sort of offensive by the Ukraine side to make the Russians want to talk. They've been willing to talk forever, even as recently as this past June, though every time the conversation comes up, the terms get worse and worse for the Ukraine side. Not as bad as it's going to be if they go all the way to defeat. But here's the thing, and despite what Shapps may say, or what any number of American folks say as well, the bottom line is that they're not winning, as you said here. And then, listen, I'm going to just show you a couple of recent tweets by Julian Ripke, the German journalist, who's quite pro-Ukraine. He's got a Ukraine flag on his site there. There's no doubt that he's definitely for Ukraine and against Russia, but he's also honest. This is one he posted on the 29th of October. He said, "We all know that I'm not revealing a military secret when I say that our front has collapsed," Ukrainian Armed Forces Major General Dmytro Marchenko said in a video released Monday evening. And so even he's putting that out there, that he's quoting a Ukrainian general that says that the front has collapsed. Ripke also published a separate list to where he pointed out, he said, listen, I think this was yesterday. The Russians are breaking through everywhere. The Ukrainian army is on the verge of collapse. Zelensky criticizes Berlin over NATO. Putin destroys Ukraine's entire heating infrastructure before the winter. And by the way, that thing is just hanging by a thread in itself. It could go. And then allegedly 10,000 North Korean soldiers will soon be fighting in the war on the Russian side. So when you look at all of that stuff, and I could pull the map up here and we could physically show it, but it's nothing that you don't already know. The war is not only has been concluded or decided rather, so that happened long ago, but now it's getting to the end game, to where the Ukrainian army could literally physically collapse, and then there could be a bull rush on by the Russian side. That's, I think, where we're at right now.
Absolutely. I think that's entirely right. I mean, we spend a lot of time, you and I, we go through and we follow what goes on the battlefronts. Of course, I don't have the, military experience or military background, but even I can see that what Julian Ripke is saying is absolutely true. And of course, he's drawing his information. It's important to say this from Ukrainian sources. He's, as you correctly said, very pro-Ukrainian. Ukraine has no more honest and true supporter in the media than Ripke. And I have a lot of respect for him, by the way. I think he's a very fine journalist, just to say that. So he's telling us the situation as it really is. You can see the fact that the front is moving steadily and rapidly towards a particular point now. You can also see something else, which is that the Russians are learning all kinds of things about how to conduct war. I can remember a point that you made years ago about how the Russians seem to be having problems with command and control and coordinating large forces. And you're starting to see that the Russians are learning how to do that. And the Ukrainians are getting weaker, their resistance is diminishing. And we've done, and this is again coming back to a point you've just made, if we could have helped the Ukrainians turn the war round, win, in other words, well, we would have done so. We've given them lots and lots of things. If there was more to give, we would have given it, more than we can afford to give. We could have given it. If the Ukrainians couldn't win with all of the things that we gave them a year ago or 2 years ago, then they are not going to win now. When the Russians are so much stronger, the Ukrainians are so much weaker. And Julian Rabka, speaking to the Ukrainian soldiers, speaking to Ukrainian commanders, which he does regularly, by the way, makes reports like that.
And you know what's really puzzling about it is this, and I'm going to show you this here in just a second, about another British fellow of yours that talks about the kind of thing that lots of people in the West, and especially the United States, also fall into. But here's what the context of what's going to follow in a second comes. To your point there, I'm going to tag off of what you just said. We don't have a lot more stuff to give. And if everything that we gave to set up in the more than a half a year prior to the 2023 failed offensive was utterly crushed and blown up on the ground, when everything that allegedly up to 2,000 total pieces of equipment with tanks, other infantry carriers, etc., in the Kursk offensive have just been turned to rusting hulks in the countryside there, on top of the tens of thousands of casualties on the Ukraine side, just to keep that pointless insertion into Russia going. We're running out of key in missiles. This was in the U.S. media here just recently. Gary, if you could toss that one up there, that we're running low on interceptor missiles. The Pentagon is running low on air defense missiles as demand surges. And that's, I guess, on the 29th. That was a couple of days ago. We've also shown here some clips from last month where the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, openly admitted that we were looking at, I think it turned out to be 17 different countries that we are supposed to supply air defense interceptor missiles to. We took all of them away and gave them to Ukraine. Now, of course, we're literally on the verge of potentially an expanded war in the Middle East with Israel and Iran. And guess what they're going to need a lot of? Interceptor missiles. And we just don't have them. So when you look at what it's costing us, not just in terms of cash, but in terms of our own depleted stockpiles of critical weapon systems, one would expect, at least it seems to me that they would, to say, okay, this isn't classified information. This is on the publicly announced stuff here, and then you can just count some of this stuff. Why are we ignoring the dwindling stockpiles, ergo putting our own national security at risk? And I'm guessing the same as in the UK, that you're running low on these things. Why then do we keep the fiction going?
Well, this is an excellent question. And can I just say, I mean, you're talking about the UK. The UK is in a far, far worse state than the United States is by definition. I mean, we've got a much smaller armed forces, a much smaller industrial base to work with. We have been incredibly generous in what we have given to Ukraine. And our army, our military is in a very poor condition by universal admission. We've practically given, apparently, all our self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine. We are simply not in a position to give more. Even sometimes you find the odd article appearing in the British media, which grudgingly acknowledges that fact. And the same is true of all of the other European countries. Europe's military industrial industries are far more fragmented than those in the United States are. And if the United States is struggling, is under stress, well, we are much more so. One of the things that I have to say, because I should say, I mean, military, I'm not a soldier, but in industrial matters, I have some experience in. One of the things I find utterly baffling is that there has never been a proper discussion about this anywhere, not just in Europe, but as far as I can see, even in the United States. There's never been a recognition of the capacity constraints that um, the warehouses, that the stockpiles are not unlimited, or of the enormous challenge that exists if you're going to restart production or start production of something entirely new, even more complicated, that this takes years. Even, if you put all the logistical and operational and engineering facilities that you have, resources behind it. The only way you can do it faster is by going over to a genuine mobilization economy, which Western societies are not ready for. And as I said, this is a debate that should have happened. It hasn't happened. It still doesn't happen. You read article after article after article says we should give more. We are holding back things on what we ought to be giving to Ukraine. We're giving the Ukrainians enough to fight, but not enough to win. Things like that. No recognition, no acceptance, no discussion of the fact that actually we are giving Ukraine, or have given Ukraine, everything that we can.
And it's funny. We had Doug McGregor on a couple of days ago, and during that I played a selection from the Pentagon spokesman, General Pat Ryder, where he was asked specifically about this. That we've given out a lot of interceptor missiles. Is that not a problem for our own national security that we're getting deeper into our constraints? And he says, no, it's fine. I mean, obviously, we know how much we have, and we're not going to give away any more than we need. And we've definitely got enough to give everybody. And then the day afterwards, you see this article that came out there I just put, where we said, actually, yeah, we are. We're running low on those. And so we have to wonder why you keep making actions that are going down a path, as you very eloquently just laid out. We can't succeed. We don't have the capacity to do this, and we can't make our industrial complex into a wartime economy, because the people would never accept it, because basically you would be saying, hey, it's going to cost us a lot of money and we're going to commit ourselves. It took Russia a better part of a year and a half to transition into a wartime economy in their production. And, now they're reaping the benefits of that. But goodness gracious, Ukraine can't stay alive another year and a half while we go through that kind of thing. But that's where we're at right now. Now, given all of that as kind of the foundation for this next year, I'm going to go again to one of your countrymen, Neil Ferguson, who was talking at the CIS in Australia recently. And he was being asked to basically give a counterpoint to John Mearsheimer, who we have on this show quite a few times, explaining why he's wrong in his assertion that it was a NATO expansion and our actions which basically prompted this whole war, and ergo our policy actions are responsible more than even the Russians are. Didn't go over well with him. And so he explained why Mearsheimer was wrong.
When George W. Bush referred in 2002 to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as an axis of evil, he misled Americans, because no such thing existed. But today, and this is what Mearsheimer seems unable to see, we confront a genuine axis that can be and should be compared with the one formed by Germany, Italy, and Japan before and in the early stages of the Second World War. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are all now openly cooperating to support Russia's war effort in Ukraine. So it was obvious 10 years ago, if not before, that Putin was ready to use brute military force to prevent Ukraine from establishing itself as a stable and prosperous democracy. And yet in 2014, the West responded feebly to his annexation of Crimea and creation of puppet states in parts of the Donbass. And then in 2021, we wholly failed to deter Putin from a full-scale invasion. So, contrary to John Mearsheimer, it was not NATO enlargement that led to war in 2022. That's Putin's line. Doesn't he understand he's parroting the Kremlin's line? What caused all this to happen was a policy that, particularly in Europe, and especially in Germany, came very close to being appeasement of Russia.
You know, there's a lot to unpack here, so I want to get into it bit by bit here. But first of all, we'll just start with that last comment he made there, because it's something that is so popular in a lot of the elite Western circles, that every year is 1938, every situation is Munich, and everybody is Hitler. And he seems to say it again here, and he's talking about this legit grouping of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran that's very much serious. But he says it's for no reason at all, except for our own weakness. How do you see that part?
Well, I think this is an absurd view. And can I just say, I mean, coming back to your point about it's always 1938. And Neil Ferguson, by the way, is a historian, and a good historian. But on this, he is completely and obviously wrong. Now, appeasement. He talks about appeasing Russia. The point to say about this is the Russians have been consistent since long before Putin appeared on the scene, all the way back to 1990 and even before, that the one thing that for them was a red line was NATO expansion, and certainly NATO expansion into Ukraine. This is not something that starts and ends with Putin. It is a universal view right across Russia. Now, whether, we agree with that or we do not agree with that, we have to face that reality. Personalizing it around Putin all the time is exactly what has led us to this point. And of course, if we go beyond that and talk about the fact that all of these various countries are coming together, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and all of those, Russia and China specifically, because they're the ones that ultimately are the two big members amongst the group that he said. Well, it's not because Putin is a bad man out to somehow expand his policy, his power across Europe. On the contrary, when we look at this, he knows perfectly well the constraints of Russian power. He knows perfectly well that Russia cannot expand in the way that Neil Ferguson talks about across Europe. It is because the Russians came to the conclusion that we were pushing constantly on their western border. We were interfering in their internal affairs. We were doing all sorts of things. And for that reason, they had no option but to make common cause with the Chinese. Now, that is the historical reality. The Russians negotiated. They negotiated all sorts of agreements with us in the 1990s. We told them, as I remember back in 1999, that NATO was an entirely peaceful alliance. It would never act in anything other than a defensive way. And then a few months later, 3 months later, we started bombing Yugoslavia without consulting them. We've supported the uprising that took place in Ukraine. We went back on agreements that we reached with the Russians about Ukraine, an agreement that was reached on the 21st of February 2014 for an orderly transition of power followed by elections. We didn't support that when
Yeah. And in fact, I want to go on, because that was one of the other comments.
All of that.
That was one of the other. Yeah, that was one of the other specific things he said, which I wanted to highlight here. He said that in 2014 we failed because we were weak, and primarily he's talking about Obama not basically going to war and not using force against Russia at the time. But he sort of doesn't remember, for a historian, and hardly any Americans even know, that there was that agreement that you just talked about there. There was an agreement in place in 2014, early 2014, that could have avoided every bit of this. And then, of course, you can add in the Minsk agreements that happened a year and or so later than that, which also could have prevented any kind of war, but we weren't going to have any of that at all. And one has to ask, what would he have argued differently Should the United States or the West have gone to war with Russia in 2014 over what was happening in the Donbass and in Crimea? What do you think were the options in 2014? What could have happened?
Well, the options were exactly as you said. The options really were not to go to war with Russia in 2014. Russia is a nuclear power. It was the nuclear power in 2014. The idea that the West would go to war with Russia over Georgia in 2014 was a fantasy. The idea that the West was prepared to go to war over Russia with Russia in 2014 during the Donbass crisis then was a fantasy. The Russians weren't looking for war in Ukraine in 2014. They were looking to negotiate a peaceful resolution of the crisis. And there was a peaceful resolution of the crisis that was agreed in the form ultimately of the Minsk Agreement. And the Minsk Agreement was never implemented. And Western leaders have all but admitted that that was because the Ukrainians didn't want to implement it, and nor did we. It's not a case of appeasement. This is a complete red herring. I know the history of the Second World War and appeasement very well. And what it was is a history of bad faith first and foremost from the Ukrainian side, but also to a great extent, it must be said, from some Western leaders.
Indeed. I mean, it's if you're being honest and talking about what actually happened, i.e. history, then you have to include all of that. And I'm sure we could go down the list and find plenty of things that the Russians didn't do and some things that they said one thing and did something different. No one's saying that anybody's innocent in this at all. But what I am saying very sternly is that we have abandoned every opportunity diplomatically to bring anything to a resolution, and that we just seem to be on this bent that we want war. And so the one of the last things he said there was then he went from 2014 to 2022 and said, again, we tried everything, and we had a chance to try to have a negotiated settlement, and they didn't want it, and they went ahead and invaded anyway. And that completely contradicts what actually happened, even as late as December. Well, actually, let me back up from that. December 2021. Let's back up to, I think it was March or April of 2021, when Zelensky signed a document that said he's going to take back all of the territories in the Donbass area by force if necessary. So it was following that then that Russia did its first buildup. And then in 2021 of December, so later that year, Putin again said, no, we're not going to have that. But here is the negotiated way out of this, which even then, Alexander, still left Kiev in nominal control over the Donbass if they agree to some of the things he asked. And now Putin did some things that were a complete non-starter that the West would never have agreed to, i.e. move everything back to, I think, the 1997 lines. But that's a negotiating position. You start asking for the world and then you come back. But we didn't negotiate anything. We weren't even willing to talk. How do you see what happened in December 2021?
Well, that's exactly correct. I mean, the simple thing that could have happened, and I'm absolutely convinced of this, I have no doubt of this at all. If the United States had come along and said to Russia at that time, there is no prospect of Ukraine ever joining NATO, full period. I mean, it's not going to happen. We're taking that completely off the table. Then there wouldn't have been a war. It is very simple. We could have worked out, by the way, all kinds of security guarantees for Ukraine. We could have worked on sorting out the Minsk situation, the Minsk Agreement, and the Donbass situation. But the Russians would certainly have been satisfied with that. They were not looking for an out-and-out crisis with the West. They didn't want an out-and-out crisis with the West at that time. They knew perfectly well that sanctions would come. They knew perfectly well that they would find themselves isolated in Europe. They didn't want any of those things. By the way, and for the record, I mean, I can't confirm this, I wasn't there, but what I've heard and what I heard on the eve of the war is that the mood in the Kremlin, in Moscow, at that time was absolutely awful. They felt that they'd been maneuvered into a position that they didn't want to be in. There was a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about what to do. Putin had to actually organize a public meeting of his inner cabinet, the Security Council, which is not something that the Kremlin has ever done before, or is likely ever to do again, as a way of trying to smooth out the differences and to basically get a decision made. And that's how it happened. Now, one doesn't necessarily have to agree with the decision the Russians took in February 2022. Maybe they should have found some other solution, or they should have looked for some other solution, or they should have tried further diplomacy. But it is not surprising, given everything, that they did the decision that they took the decision that they did. One of the fundamental problem with people like Neil Ferguson, if I may say, is that he sees everything completely from the West's perspective. He never wants to acknowledge that the other side has a perspective and a opinion as well. Certainly an opinion about its own security, which is a vital matter for any state, especially a state with a history like Russia, but any state, to make that clear. And he refuses to basically, to have it, to acknowledge the fact that they have that perspective.
Well, yeah, and it would come in handy when one of the last things that he said in that clip that I want to talk about, in that he just kind of reiterated and ridiculed Mr. Mearsheimer from saying that it was NATO enlargement and the threat of that, because Stoltenberg actually, I don't remember if it was December 21 or January 22, I can't remember the one, but he went through and firmly said nobody is going to tell us who is or isn't going to come into NATO. If we say Ukraine's coming in, they're coming in, and they are coming in. So he reiterated that again on the eve of the fighting here. And to suggest that had no role in it is ridiculous and just, it's counterintuitive to any humanity. Would we be okay if the Warsaw Pact, where it's still alive, said, you know what, how about we make a deal with France right on the British border there, or with Mexico on the American border? It's a defensive alliance. Don't worry, everything's fine. We're not going to do anything. Obviously, we would lose our minds. And so for Mr. Ferguson and all those who say the same thing he does, it is beyond ridiculous to say that played no role in it. And we know for a fact that it played a role in it, because former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg cleared that up. Gary, if you can roll that tape.
Declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that.
Okay, that's good enough. That's fine. He said it straight up that Putin told them ahead of time, if you keep going in with NATO, we're going to use military force to stop it. He told them that privately. And that confirms, by the way, something another diplomat told me about something that happened between Biden and Putin in the summer of 2021, in June 2021. So those things are now confirmed. And he said it open mouth that, yes, there wouldn't have been a war if we had done that. But of course, we're not going to sign that. So now that we know for a fact that happened. So how then do people like Mr. Ferguson and all those who held that viewpoint just ignore that fact and just say, well, I didn't want it to make a difference, so it didn't?
Well, because they're engaging in rhetoric. I think he's not engaging with facts. He's not going through the facts. What he's basically doing is he's engaging in a rhetorical pose. He says, look, Putin is bad. He doesn't like Ukraine for some reason. He doesn't really explain why Putin doesn't like Ukraine. So he just decides one fine morning that he's going to invade Ukraine. And we've let him do that and encouraged him to do that because we were intent on appeasing him. And the result is that we have this big axis of evil, which didn't exist before, but which now does. And it's not our fault. It's not, we're not in any way to blame for the fact that it's come about, that the Russians who were, working towards us, trying to work into Western institutions, conducting economic trade with us, doing those kind of things, that they've been spurned and turned away, and that there's now this axis between China and Russia and all of that. So we're not to blame for that. We are entirely innocent. We're not responsible at all. It is entirely the other side. It's entirely Putin. As I said, this is rhetoric. It's not real explanation or analysis, and we should not be confused by it. It's rhetorical, and it's manipulative as well, by the way.
But let me see. Here's where I'm still having a hard time grasping. I get that. I get totally that he's making this speech and he wants to show why his side is right. I get no problem with that. But there seems to be a hole in the logic here, because why do I, with someone of the credibility of Neil Ferguson and the respect that he gets everywhere, want to hold a position that you can see it's not sustainable? It's not going to work for all the reasons we've shown. And so why would he say hold a position that history is going to show was never valid?
Well, indeed, and that's a very good question, because as a historian, he should know better. I mean, I have to say this. I mean, a historian of all people should know that these considerations, these issues that the Russians were flagging were serious issues. They are consistent with the kind of serious issues that states often bring up in international relations. It is diplomacy to understand that. It is diplomacy to try to meet with them. All I can say is this. Neil Ferguson is a good historian, but on this specific issue, for reasons which only he can explain, he's decided to go with the mainstream, and as I said, to take a rhetorical and political position, to act like an advocate, in other words, for Western policy, instead of conducting that proper factual investigation and analysis, which is a historian's job.
Yeah, and you know, and by the way, I don't want to make it sound like I'm trying to just trash on Mr. Ferguson.
No.
I'm just using him as an example, because there's many in the United States who hold that view, and these people are all very influential, and people listen to them. And you know, there's a lot of people that actually aren't very many people who are going to watch shows like yours or like this one here, where we're talking, where we're laying out the logic behind what it is, and so that keeps people supporting something that evidence and logic say is not going to work. And you know, so that kind of brings us back full circle to where it started here. The facts on the ground scream overwhelmingly this war is basically over, and the end result has been known for a long time. We're just waiting to see how long is it going to take for the Russian army, which has irrevocable benefits on its side that can't be changed in human course, and the Ukraine side is deficient in ways that can't be rectified in a time frame in anybody's life here, and they're going to lose the war. And so now then we're starting to see that not only is the Ukraine side losing territory in the battlefield, they're losing men at an unsustainable rate. They can't recruit guys at a sustainable rate. The guys that they do get are terrible quality because they're not trained. They don't want to be there. Their morale is low because they see what happened to everybody who came before them. You get the point. Every metric you want to look at that's quantifiable in most cases screams that the war cannot be won. And so now then we're getting into what's kind of the end game here. And you hear, like we had Zelensky at the top of this show talking about, you know, how he's got a victory plan and how they're not going to give away any inch of territory, and they're going to have high standards for the demand of Russia, et cetera, as though that was even theoretically possible. And that reminds me of another time where something similar was happening in World War II in April of 1945. And another British historian, Anthony Beevor, very eloquently explained what happened during that one.
And of course, the briefings themselves, dealing with the forces, lacked no connection with reality. I mean, Hitler, once again, was looking at the maps, was saying that's an army, that's a division, or whatever, when in fact, they just consisted often of very few men.
And there was a movie. What was it called? The Downfall, that was out not long ago, that talked about the very last elements of the Hitler, and how he was, giving orders to different divisions and telling them where to go, and most of them were only on paper, etc. And I just can't help but see the correlation between those two. Yeah, that's some of the scenes we're playing in the background there, and you'll see some of the maps and some of the actual people who were part of that. But gosh, Alexander, I mean, you see that the people in the room, this is interesting. The people in this room that's being reenacted here, when Hitler's given these instructions about where to go, and the Soviets were coming in, and then he's going to give instructions on where to go, etc. And that sounds so similar to Zelensky talking about how he's going to have a victory plan, and how he's not going to give up any terrain, and how he's going to move his divisions into Kursk and wherever else. And yet, when you look at the actual ground, those things just aren't even realistic at all. How do you see the correlation between what happened in 1945 and right now?
It is exactly the same, and the reasons are exactly the same. Because, of course, Hitler and the people around him would not accept that Germany should negotiate. That was absolutely, obviously, out of the question. They refused to contemplate any conceivable idea of capitulation or surrender. In other words, they would not accept the reality that the war was lost. So since they weren't prepared to accept that reality, that major fundamental underlying reality, that led them inevitably to act as if the war could still be won. And in order to pretend to themselves that the war could still be run, we started to have these fantastic plans. The plan to move divisions around here, to attack there, to do all of these sort of things all the time. And you are seeing exactly the same in Ukraine now, because as we discussed at the start of the program, Zelensky, despite the fact that at some level he undoubtedly does know how bad the situation is, he will never ever agree to negotiate a peace on realistic terms. He's going to go on refusing to do so, I personally believe, to the very end. And inevitably, that leads him to lose all connection to ultimate reality. And he's already talking about, more offensives, more victory plans, more far-fetched ideas about how the war can be won, getting the West involved. I mean, Hitler was talking about the same kind of things, that the United States and the Soviet Union were going to go to war just before the war collapsed, and that was how Germany would ultimately prevail, and all that kind of thing, all these far-fetched and disconnected things, no connection to reality, because
and I'm just showing here I'm showing on the screen here as you're talking. This is where Vuhledar fell after having a year and 8 months of going after it, and then finally when it did, it's like it broke the dam. And you see how far Russia's now just rolling up in there. And of course, in the Pokrovsk area, that they've taken all this area. This was this area here was a great big cauldron. It's now gone. Selidova gone. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when we were talking about, some of these other places like Ochertina. They're moved way beyond that now. And now here comes Pokrovsk up into play here. And that's one of the last major ones that could literally be the gate that blows into the back, because there's hardly any in this whole area back here. There's very few fortifications built at all. And once Russia breaks through this, there's very little that's stopping them anywhere. I mean, it literally is unfolding like 1945, and one wonders how much longer that's going to go, and how many more Ukrainian men are going to continue to throw their lives away in fighting what's not merely a losing battle, but it's almost suicide.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's the great tragedy. And that was the tragedy, by the way, that overtook the German people as well. I mean, I know Germany very well. And I mean, there's a lot that could be said about the history of those times. And, I'm not here to argue that, Germany's tragedy was greater than the tragedy of other nations that got caught up in the war. On the contrary, I mean, that's absolutely not my view. But the fact is that I know people who were I knew people, I should say, that they've passed away now, who were called up as soldiers in those last few weeks and months of the war. Mm-hmm. One person who particularly befriended me, who was brought into the army as a teenager, he only survived because he came up against the American army. and an American soldier was sorry for him and shot him in the leg so that he wouldn't be killed. And this person never forgot that. And he never forgot what happened to Germany. And he became a major peace campaigner in his part of Germany thereafter. And that's the same horror that is being inflicted now on the Ukrainian people, who have none of the responsibilities that the Germans had in the 1940s.
Yeah, and that's just this total tragedy of the human tragedy. We talk a lot about maps and cities and, you know, bills that are coming in or how many tanks or whatever, but it's the human people that are paying this ultimate casualties here. And you know, we've got guys like General Ben Hodges of the retired U.S. Army, who's just the biggest advocate of continuing to go. You have Lindsey Graham in the U.S. Senate, that is absolutely the biggest cheerleader for just keep giving them everything they ask for, et cetera, with no idea or apparently no concern about the human cost to the very people we claim we want to help. And that is one of the hardest things for me to get my head around.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We need to get down to reality. We need to, as I said, put the rhetoric aside and look at the facts as they actually are. Ukraine is clearly losing the war. The Ukrainian soldiers are suffering in exactly the way that you said. The Ukrainian army is weak and getting weaker. They're being replaced by men who do not want to fight and who aren't able to fight in many cases. Yeah. And the Russians are advancing, and they're going to go on advancing. And we're not going to be able to stop them. So because the Russians, as I said, are tough-minded, hard-headed people, because Putin isn't Hitler. I mean, let's just put that nonsense to one side. Let's talk to him. Let's see whether we can come to some kind of agreement which will save what we can save in Ukraine and which will secure a lasting peace in Europe, because that is the situation. That is the reality now.
Okay, at first I said you could, I would advise you to be NATO Secretary General, but also the next Prime Minister of UK. If you take those policies in there, I will advocate for that as well. Gosh, how I wish we had anyone in any of these Western countries that were willing to do something like that. And who knows if Trump wins, he may make good on his claim to bring the thing to an end. I don't know. It's a coin flip, as to who might win. And Harris, who knows what she would do. But it's just hard for me to imagine anybody that's going to stand up and say, yeah, we're going to do the right thing. And what you just articulated, which I certainly second without hesitation. In the last few minutes that we have here, if I could just get you to kind of give me your best estimate of what the West will face if we don't accede to reality, if we don't do what you suggested there, if Trump doesn't win and they just Harris perpetuates the current administration, and we keep going down the fiction path. What is going to be the dilemma for the West on that inevitable day when the Ukrainian army collapses?
We're going to have a situation where the Russians will move westwards. We don't know how far westward they intend to go or will go, but they will go there. And they will go there in force. They will go there as an extremely powerful army. And many people in Europe will be extremely worried about that. And if we're not prepared to negotiate, then the danger is, in fact, the certainty is that the hostility in Europe, the mutual suspicion, the fear will crystallize. And we will get into another situation like the one we had during the Cold War, where we had the Russians on the one side, we have the United States and its allies on the other. There's once again permanent tension in Europe. There's permanent instability in Eastern Europe because the Ukraine issue itself has not been resolved. With all of that uncertainty, the United States will have to send hundreds and hundreds of thousands of troops to Europe again, or could find itself obliged to do so. Troops that it doesn't really have, because of course the world has changed and the commitments that the United States faces around the world today are so much greater. In other words, another exhausting drain on American resources. And of course, the alternative to that would be perhaps the United States eventually coming to some kind of deal. But if we wait for that time, all kinds of very dangerous and bad things could happen in the meantime. And of course, the situation in Europe itself would become very dangerous, very stressed. We would have to worry about war all the time in a way that we have not had the need to do for, 30 years now. And societies begin to remilitarize. All the suspicions and all the fears that go with that would come back. So it'd be an absolute, complete disaster. It'd be a geopolitical disaster. It'd be an economic and social disaster, and it would be a huge problem, a massive headache for the United States. I really do hope that statesmanship is eventually discovered, and we avoid that. We avoid that calamity.
Well, I literally could not improve a word on what you just said, and won't even attempt to do so. And you have so starkly laid out the different visions of what could be, how we could bring this to a merciful end now, and actually preserve something for Ukraine and get us back to security and safety and not worrying about war. Or we can keep going down the path we're on, and we have that much darker view. And you didn't even mention the possibility that it could go into nuclear escalation. That's, I guess, pretty self-evident. So let's just hope and pray, like you said, that we do find some kind of statesmanship somewhere, that finally people pierce through the fog of this self-deception to do something that makes sense while we still can. Thank you so much for coming on today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
My pleasure too.
And thank you guys for being with us. We are always appreciative. Also, remember, we are on podcast now, just anywhere you get your podcast, Apple podcast, Spotify, all these different places. Anything that where you get them, you can find our podcast there. Just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will be taken right to it. Thank you very much. And don't forget, we have Alex of History Legends on tomorrow, where he's going to be talking about what's going on with the invasion of Lebanon and can the IDF win. He's got a new video that's going to be coming out. I think it may have already come out by now. Do not miss that one. He has got some stuff that you will not see anywhere else. Be sure and tune in at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon for Daniel Davis Deep Dive.